every crime scene, there is always some evidence left behind. Fingerprints, hair, fibers, blood. Evidence that, when analyzed, can usually link a criminal to the crime. In this episode, the first time in America, DNA helped put a man on death row.
I could sense that this is going to revolutionize the way we approach crime scene evidence.
And in a second case, how this new forensic tool solved a 20-year-old murder.
DNA was the solution to this case. Without the DNA technology, he would still be out there. There's no question.
For these forensic experts, solving crimes is not only a science, it's an art they call dead reckoning. It was the Tuesday after Thanksgiving in 1987, and Arlington, Virginia's detective Joe Horgus was on duty.
It's called Next Up in the Barrel. It was my turn.
The call was about a homicide in an Arlington suburb just outside of Washington, D.C. Detective Horgus knew right away the victim had been dead for a couple of days. He and the other officers proceeded through the house. In the master bedroom, they found the body of Susan Tucker. She was lying face down, her head slung over the side of the bed.
Her hands were tied behind her back, and there was a rope going from her hands up to her neck. And these ropes were brand new, nice shiny white. She was nude, and there was I believe it was a blue sleeping bag or something similar that was over her buttocks. Susan Tucker had been probably laying in this position for several days.
Susan Tucker, age 44, was married with no children. She was a federal employee. At the time of the murder, her husband was in Great Britain, visiting his family in Wales, where the couple had been planning to move. CSI officers John Cole and Rick Shomes from the Arlington County Police Department investigated the crime scene.
It was a very gruesome scene, probably one of the most gruesome that I had witnessed during my career here at Arlington. You think about how someone can do something like this to another human being, and obviously this was somebody that had to be taken off the streets as soon as possible.
We then started documenting the crime scene. We did mid-range close-up photography.
The investigators noticed a number of potentially revealing clues. There was a half-eaten orange on the dining room table, and alongside it, a butcher knife. On the floor nearby was an empty purse, its contents scattered on the floor. Then, detectives Horgus and Shomes zeroed in on what they believed to be the point of entry by the assailant.
At the rear of the townhouse, there was a balcony-type patio coming out of the dining room area. Underneath this patio was a basement window. It was broken out.
We collected all the glass that we could find, not just sample glass, but we collected all the glass fragments.
These glass fragments could be useful in later identifying a suspect.
There is a transfer of the glass fragments, be they ever so small or whatever size, that they transfer from the actual point of entry in this way to whatever clothing that the suspect had on at the time of the crime.
The window where the assailant entered was right above the washer-dryer.
I did use oblique lighting to look at the top of that surface. It was very obvious to me that the surface had been wiped down with a towel, a rag, or some sort of material to obviously not allow either a footprint or a handprint or fingerprint to be obtained.
While investigators Cole and Shomes collected the evidence and dusted the rest of the house for prints, Detective Horgus headed back to the police station. Driving back, he couldn't help thinking of the phone call from the detective who had notified him of the murder.
And when he called me at home, he said, "It's Carolyn Ham all over again."
3 years earlier in 1984, Carolyn Hamm, a Washington, D.C. attorney, had been raped and strangled to death just a few blocks away.
Even though I didn't work Carolyn Hamm, I was familiar with it. I had seen the photos and everything of the crime scene.
It was very much like what he had just seen.
Carolyn Hamm was found nude and with a rope around her neck. Her hands bound behind her back. Rope went up over a pipe and then was tied to the bumper of a car that was parked in the garage.
And there were other similarities.
I could see the similarity, especially with the point of entry. The point of entry is what stuck out in my mind. Carolyn Hamm, the point of entry was also a narrow opening that that perpetrator had gotten into.
And just like with Susan Tucker, the contents of Hamm's purse had been dumped on the floor, yet nothing of value was missing.
It all seemed to be parallel. So because of this, I guess I was itching almost to get back to the police department and pull the Carolyn Hamm file to get my leads for this case.
Detective Horgus knew the Carolyn Hamm case was closed. A man had been convicted of her murder and was already behind bars, but doubts remained.
Everyone who worked the case didn't think that that suspect, whose name was David Vasquez, did it by himself. They thought that he was the lesser of two evils involved in that case and that the main guy was still out there.
David Vasquez was serving 35 years. He had pled guilty to avoid the death penalty. Though 2 eyewitnesses placed Vasquez in the neighborhood at the time of the murder, the physical evidence failed to implicate him. Now, 3 years later, here was the same exact crime.
I guess I thought the same thing that everyone else did. How could this be? We're talking about generally the same neighborhood, and Arlington's not that big a community. The same type of crime, the same method of, or cause of death, I should say.
Detective Horgus was certain another man was responsible for Hamm's murder, and that the killer was still out there and had killed again.
I thought I had to find out who killed Carolyn Hamm in order to find out who killed Susan Tucker.
Detective Horgus had no idea that a then relatively unknown forensic tool would be the key to solving both murders. Detective Joe Horgus was convinced that whoever killed Susan Tucker had also murdered Carolyn Hamm 3 years before.
A burglary, a known rape and murder, it all seemed to be parallel.
Despite the similarities, Horgus had no leads. No fingerprints were found at the Tucker home. Even that half-eaten orange failed to offer any clues.
The orange we had examined to see if we could get bite marks, teeth marks on it, but it was too deteriorated. We didn't get anything off of that.
Horgus had hopes for the other physical evidence.
Well, keep in mind, when I brought everything, I didn't know what to expect. When you send stuff to the lab, I want them to tell me what I'm looking for.
Deanne Dabbs, a supervisor with Virginia's Forensic Science Division, began analyzing all the evidence. The sleeping bag that covered Susan Tucker, her nightgown, and a washcloth with smears on it.
What I'm looking for is any hairs or fibers that might be of value, and any blood stains or semen stains. With regard to the nightgown, I found 4 different stains.
Dabbs performed an acid phosphatase test on the stains. A purplish color indicated the presence of semen. But to confirm it, the stain was examined microscopically.
I remove a small portion of that stain, cut it up into small pieces, place it into a test tube, place a small amount of water onto the cuttings, and shake the tube in an attempt to remove the seminal fluid from the material into the water. And then I remove a small portion of that liquid, put it on a microscope slide, and then examine the slide microscopically, looking for the male reproductive cells.
Semen was positively identified, but whose was it? In 1987, the only way to begin to connect semen to a rapist was first of all by determining if any blood was present in it. If so, then the blood could be typed.
Prior to the advent of forensic DNA analysis, we typed blood stains and semen stains in the ABO blood group system and in several enzyme systems.
The blood found was type O and matched neither the victim nor her husband. The results narrowed down the field of possible suspects, but not by much. But the stained washcloth did hold an additional piece of the puzzle. As she examined it, Dabbs pulled out 2 pubic hairs.
Hairs are removed. They're ultimately mounted onto glass slides and examined microscopically. And the outer covering of hair is known as the cuticle. The cuticle basically is a protective covering for hair. When the cuticle of hair becomes damaged, it will lift away from the shaft of the hair.
Under that cortex are pigment granules. A close examination can determine the race of a suspect. Caucasian hair pigment granules are small, fine, and evenly distributed.
Whereas in Negroid hairs, the pigment granules tend to be coarser, somewhat larger, and clumped together.
Dabbs determined that these pubic hairs did come from a black man. Knowing the assailant was black was a major clue in the case. While Detective Horgus was still investigating a possible link to the 1984 Hom murder, he also started looking at other past rapes that had similar MOs.
In the back of my mind, I also remembered this rapist from back in '83 who was raping before Carolyn Ham's murder. And I started to look at those series also.
That rapist had never been caught and was still out there. But in interviews with his victims, Horgus learned the rapist was a black man who wore a mask.
He cut the Venetian blinds of a bedroom window to tie his rape victim up. To me, it was very significant because Carolyn Ham's hands were tied behind her back when she was found.
Was there a connection? Had the serial rapist progressed to murdering his victims? Before Detective Horgus could check out that theory, the investigation took another turn. He learned that in Richmond, 2 hours south of Arlington, a serial murderer was on the loose. Known as the Southside Strangler, he had raped and murdered 3 women in the last 3 months. Could the Southside Strangler be responsible for the murders in Arlington? Detective Horgus went down to Richmond to compare notes. The similarities were startling. All 3 victims had been tied up and strangled. In each case, the murderer had entered through a window. In addition, no fingerprints were found at the scenes, and all were made to look like burglaries, only nothing was ever missing.
Left there thinking that now there's 5 murders that this subject had committed.
Forensic tests confirmed his suspicions. Lab tests revealed that the semen stains obtained from the Richmond murders were identical in blood type to those discovered on Susan Tucker's nightgown. But a common blood type was hardly enough to implicate a killer, much less convict him. Early on, Detective Horgus began hearing about DNA fingerprinting, and in fact, Helen Fahey, the prosecutor for Arlington County, had asked the detective about it.
I was upgrading her on the case, and I remember her saying to me, "Is this going to be a DNA case?" And actually, that was the first mention of DNA in this case. I was completely ignorant, I guess. I knew nothing about DNA.
In 1987, DNA testing was not widely used in forensics. It had only been 3 years earlier in 1984 that British scientist Sir Alec Jeffreys developed a method of genetic identification. Just like fingerprints, these molecules found in most cells of the body could accurately identify an individual. Forensic examiners in Virginia were excited and curious about this new science.
The more questions I asked about this technology, the more I realized that we were looking at tomorrow's forensic science. I could sense that this is going to revolutionize the way we approach crime scene evidence.
Only the year before, in 1986, the British scientist had used DNA fingerprinting to help solve 2 rape cases in England.
Before the advent of DNA technology, we could not help the police more in the investigative phase of their work.
Now it was possible. Detective Horgus took the semen stain evidence from the Tucker murder to Life Codes Laboratory in New York, one of the only labs in America doing DNA analysis at that time. Richmond police also submitted their semen samples from the 3 murders. Back then, the identification process was limited in sensitivity.
One required a blood sample the size of a 50-cent piece or a seminal fluid stain approximately the size of the dime.
The first step was removing the biological material from the physical evidence.
We would simply chop the DNA, this long molecule, into small pieces. We then had to separate those pieces, a process called gel electrophoresis, and then we would focus on the specific pieces of DNA that were highly unique for an individual. We had to use radioactive probes, and they showed up as dark spots on a standard photographic film.
In the late 1980s, the whole process could take 8 to 10 weeks. Detective Joe Horgus would have to wait to learn if this new scientific method could tie one person to at least 5 murders. Detective Joe Horgus believed a serial murderer had killed 5 Virginia women. One in 1984, and 4 others, including Susan Tucker, in 1987.
They were all similar cases. When you tie everything together, you might say I developed a theory that this black rapist from 1983 was responsible for all 5 women's murder.
Detective Horgus hoped the DNA analysis of evidence from the different crime scenes would confirm his suspicions. But if he was right, why did this murderer stop killing in 1984 and start again in 1987? Why a 3-year gap? The detective concluded the suspect had probably been in prison.
Ultimately, the way my investigation went, I was looking for someone who got arrested after Carolyn Hamm's murder and who got released from prison sometime in 1987.
Police in Arlington and Richmond searched through probation and parole reports. Detective Horgus went back and studied the files of the black masked rapist who was still on the loose. His first rape in 1983 had been committed in Green Valley, a section of Arlington. For the detective, this could be an important clue.
Rapist usually does his first act somewhere close to home because he feels comfortable and he knows his escape routes. We had to run thousands of names through the computer looking for someone from that area And they didn't have to be from that area because I also knew that they could have had a relative in that area, they could have worked in that area. But the big thing was that gap. They had to be incarcerated for almost a 4-year period.
Taking all this into account and refreshing his memory about his own cases from the Green Valley area, Horgus recalled a case involving a young man named Timothy Spencer.
I had a burglary down in the Green Valley area where he was a suspect. And I remember I had to go to his mother's house. We wanted elimination fingerprints from him as a suspect, either to eliminate him or make him.
Though Spencer had not been convicted of the burglary, Detective Horgus entered his name into the computer. He got a hit.
His record showed that he was arrested in Alexandria, Virginia on January 29th, 1984.
Timothy Spencer had been sent to prison for breaking and entering 2 homes in Alexandria. Released in 1987, Spencer then went to a halfway house in Richmond, just 2 weeks before the first murder occurred there.
We checked the records for the halfway house down in Richmond, where he was at, and found out that for every murder, he was available. He checked out of the halfway house for every murder, significantly for Arlington, because he actually got a furlough to come home for Thanksgiving, which is when Susan Tucker would have been killed.
Based on the dates of the murders and where Timothy Spencer was at the time, he was now a strong suspect.
What it came down to was, did we have enough for probable cause? Did we have enough to go to the grand jury and ask them to indict him?
Prosecutor Helen Fahey and Detective Horgus believed they did. On January 20th, 1988, almost 2 months after the rape and murder of Susan Tucker, Timothy Spencer was arrested. At the time, they had little evidence, just the remnants of glass that had been broken when the killer entered the Tucker home. With his arrest, police went through Spencer's room at the halfway house, where they found his pants, ski mask, and army jacket.
There was a little bit of glass evidence on a jacket that they had found from the window that the person had broken into.
Lab tests were conducted on the glass and compared to the shards from the broken window at Susan Tucker's home. Both had the same optical properties.
But you could never convict someone on that basis.
That's because the glass was not unique enough to distinguish it from hundreds of other windows. The only physical evidence that could possibly link Spencer to the crime was DNA. After his arrest, a sample of his blood was taken so that his DNA profile could be drawn. Life Codes was still analyzing the DNA from the Tucker murder and the murders in Richmond.
At that time, it took a long time to get the results from DNA testing. It would be done what they referred to as one gel at a time. And the way we got the results was literally, we got a phone call saying we got the first one back and it matches. And now we're working on the second one.
4 months after Susan Tucker was murdered, the results came in. The DNA from the crime scene matched Timothy Spencer perfectly. The odds Spencer didn't kill her, 1 in 700 million.
I think I called up Helen Fahey right away. She came over and gave me a big kiss. It was fabulous.
But now there was another challenge: how to get the DNA admitted into court. At the time, DNA had only been used once in an American trial and never in a capital murder case. Even before Timothy Spencer's trial started, prosecutor Helen Fahey had to convince a judge to allow it into evidence.
When you're talking about something that's brand new like DNA that has never been admitted in a court in the state of Virginia, you have a very high burden to convince the court that it's good evidence.
Experts were brought before the judge to explain this new scientific technology. He ended up allowing it into evidence. In July 1988, the Timothy Spencer trial began. DNA took center stage.
The only evidence upon which we believed that a jury could base a conviction was the DNA evidence.
Experts, including Dr. Paul Ferrara from Virginia's forensic lab, explained the science to the jury and testified as to its accuracy.
It was absolutely essential that the jury understand it and believe that they could rely on it in making a decision.
The jury did believe it and heard a guilty verdict. Timothy Spencer's since death, the murder of Sinter, he became the first person in America to be convicted in a capital murder case solely on the basis of DNA evidence.
We arrested Spencer without DNA. There more likely would not have been enough to convict without DNA. He was a serial murderer. Would he have had to do more before he caught? I don't know, but thank God we have DNA. That's all I can say.
DNA eventually linked Timothy Spencer to the 3 murders in the Richmond area, for which he was convicted and sentenced to death.
Murder's the ultimate crime. And when you solve any murder, it's what every homicide detective thrives for.
But Spencer was never tried for the Carolyn Hamm murder. The physical evidence from the crime scene was not well preserved, so a DNA comparison could not be made. But now, with Spencer's conviction in the other cases, there were serious doubts about David Vasquez's guilt in the murder of Carolyn Hamm. Prosecutor Helen Fahey recommended that Vasquez receive a pardon.
And we submitted a rather extensive brief to the governor outlining all of the evidence that we had which pointed to Spencer and not to David Vasquez.
David Vasquez was granted a pardon and released in 1989. DNA had succeeded in convicting the right person for the crime. Convinced that DNA would become a necessary investigative tool, Dr. Paul Ferrara opened Virginia's first DNA lab that same year.
The Timothy Spencer case in Virginia probably represented one of the most important steps in the evolution and use of the DNA technology in Virginia.
Timothy Spencer was executed in 1994. Next, a 20-year-old cold case murder solved by DNA. On July 25, 1980, it was a sweltering 98 degrees in Hampton, Virginia, 15 miles from Norfolk. On that day, the body of 47-year-old Dorothy White was found inside her trailer park home by 2 of Dorothy's co-workers from the Virginia National Bank. They had gone to the trailer when she failed to show up for work and found her stabbed to death.
Dorothy! Need an ambulance now.
Hampton, Virginia police cordoned off the area surrounding the trailer. Detective Richard Martin was the crime scene investigator.
The trailer was very clean. It wasn't really disturbed. I noticed the front door, had no forced entry to it. I saw the victim laying on the kitchen floor. There's blood spatter everywhere, on the cabinet doors, especially a large amount of blood on the floor around her body, especially around her head area, shoulder area. And I saw that her throat had been slashed very badly. I had seen throats slashed and cut before, but not in this nature. Her throat was cut from side to side.
Dorothy's bra and shirt were hiked up around her neck. Detective Edgar Browning, who later would become key to solving this case, called it a lust murder.
It was a classic rape-motivated murder. The crime was so horrendous, and fortunately in Hampton we did not have too many crimes of that genre.
Dorothy had obviously put a struggle.
She She had defense wounds in her hand where she would grab the knife blade and would pull the blade out of her hands. And she did have a few cuts on the back of her arm as you would throw your arm up to defend the blows. And then she had a few stab wounds in her upper portion of her body. I just knew that this lady had put up a good fight.
Martin and his partner took blood swabs and a swab from a drinking glass. They also collected other evidence.
There was a crochet needle inside the area that you really don't know exactly what took place or what was used unless it had blood on it. So we just took several items in order to possibly tie this into the crime scene.
Also dusted for prints.
I found a partial palm print on the right door frame as you would enter her home.
In the bedroom, Dorothy's purse and its contents were strewn all over the bed. Detectives packaged the items for evidence along several rugs that would later be tested for hair and fiber. Dorothy White was an attractive single woman who for years had a long-term relationship with Bill Anthony, a used car dealer and former Hampton police officer. But most of her time was spent with her family, her brother Clyde and sister-in-law Doris White.
We had a lot of times, a lot of good times. Dot always tried to come over on Thursday and have a meal with us. Birthdays and holidays, she always spent it at our house with my husband and the children. And we've got many memories.
Dorothy's murder devastated the family.
The worst shock I've ever had. And that somebody would take her life. And so young as she was, 47 years old.
At the Hampton Police Department, CSI Detective Martin packaged the evidence and submitted it to the lab for testing. In 1980, DNA had not yet been used in forensics. The standard procedure for comparing any blood found at the scene to the blood of suspects was through serology tests, which determined blood type. All of Dorothy White's physical evidence was placed in the Physical Evidence Recovery Kit, also known as the PERC kit.
Slides that contain the swabs that are taken from the victim, the combings of the pubic region taken at the time of the autopsy, microscopic evidence.
While the evidence was being tested, police canvassed the area. All possible suspects were quickly cleared through the serology tests. That included a Newport News police officer who lived near Dorothy and had come into the trailer after the two co-workers discovered her body.
They had nothing they could get him with because they didn't have the evidence.
More bad news followed when the evidence from the crime scene produced absolutely no leads. No hair, no fiber, no fingerprints, nothing. Months soon turned into years.
A lot of times we would go over to the police station. I told them I could not understand how in the world anybody could go in there and do what they did to her. And nobody in that trailer court heard nothing.
It would take almost 2 decades and a critical development in DNA technology before Dorothy White's murder would be solved. Through the years, the Dorothy White murder case faded from the headlines. No new evidence, witnesses, or viable suspects ever emerged. It became one of many cold cases.
In the absence of any witness information or usable physical evidence, it's very difficult to pursue these cases.
During the 1990s, an increasing number of cases were being solved through DNA. The cases were making news.
DNA testing is also growing popular in some very private trials.
Doris White, Dorothy's sister-in-law, had heard of DNA. She didn't understand how it worked, but she knew it could solve crimes. 2 years after Dorothy's murder, Doris's husband Clyde became seriously ill. He had always been frustrated that his sister's murder had never been solved. But before he died, Doris made him a promise.
When they told us he was not going to make it, I said, I'll never give up. I'll always see if we can't find the one that did that to Dot.
She thought DNA just might be her last hope. In 1999, 19 years after Dorothy's murder, Doris called the Hampton Police Department and spoke with Detective Sergeant Edgar Browning.
I told him who I was and that we were like for the police department, take the evidence that they had there and do a DNA and see if we couldn't get this guy that had killed her.
Browning went to the archives, pulled out the White file, and began reviewing it.
It wasn't the first time I had went over that file, so I was pretty familiar with it. I had not forgotten the pictures. Once you see them, for someone in my line of work, they're pretty much burned into your mind. The most important thing in this case was to attempt to locate the physical evidence, because that would hold promise in this day and age with DNA comparison.
A couple of days later, maybe 3 days, he called back and he said, Ms. White, he said, I've got some bad news. He says, we can't find the perk kit. I said, oh my God. I said, that's the only thing we had that would point to the one that killed her.
It turned out that the perk kit had just been misfiled. 2 days later, it was found and sent to the East Virginia laboratory in Norfolk for DNA testing. Since the late 1980s, when DNA was first used for the Timothy Spencer case, the technology had changed dramatically. Back then, testing took more than 8 weeks to complete. In 1999, it took only days and didn't require as large a sample for testing.
We have the sensitivity that allows us to detect the most minute and varied forms of DNA. A minute blood stain that can perhaps hardly be seen with the naked eye, chewing gum, so cigarette butts, perspiration on shirt collars, ski masks, even the body oils on the inside of a latex glove.
Forensic scientist Dave Pompasini examined the evidence from the perk kit.
In the Dorothy White case, there was seminal fluid was identified from the swabs that were collected at autopsy.
Their first step was to isolate the DNA.
And I like to look at it as an eggshell. Cracking the shell to get to the yolk of the egg would be the nucleus of the cell, which would contain the DNA.
Once isolated, the DNA is now put through a PCR amplification process. First used in the early 1990s, the PCR is a huge development in DNA technology. Now, even the tiniest sample of DNA is put through the PCR, which then churns out millions of copies, giving scientists enough DNA to draw up a profile.
Once we have an amplified product and we determine that we have DNA that's typable, it's placed on a typing gel. We separate out the DNA fragments. We look at various locations on the DNA that helps differentiate you and I from each other.
Now, DNA from Dorothy's murder could be compared to DNA from suspects police had interviewed almost 20 years earlier. One of those was the police officer who lived near Dorothy White.
That effort resulted in clearing him of any involvement in this crime.
But there were countless others that could be checked. 10 years earlier in 1989, Virginia had been the first state to create a statewide DNA databank. By 1999, the databank contained DNA profiles of over 100,000 offenders. Could Dorothy White's murderer be on file? To find out, the crime scene evidence was entered into the data bank. The computer then searched its list, looking for anyone who fit the profile. In just seconds, there was a cold hit. An exact match.
From just that sample of DNA found at the crime scene, we have been able to call up the investigator and give them the name of the person that they need to be looking for.
For detectives, like he has a crew of men working for him to help him solve this crime.
Finally, after all these years, Dorothy White's murderer had been found. The man's name was William Morissette.
Morissette, I never heard of him.
But Morissette knew Dorothy White. He had been employed by Dorothy's boyfriend and had occasionally done yard work for her. Morissette was in the data bank because of another crime he committed in May 1985. His victim was Virginia Brown, who was sitting in her car at her daughter's high school parking lot. She was waiting for her to finish band practice. To pass the time, she was needle pointing. Suddenly, a man approached the car and tried to gag her with a handkerchief. Though Brown put up a fight, the man pushed his way inside the car and held a knife up to her face and neck. Brown managed to grab her car keys and throw them out the window. As another car approached, the man fled. Based on Brown's description, William Morissette was arrested 2 days later. Morissette served 8 years for assault and attempted abduction. He was released before his DNA profile was entered into the data bank. But in 1994, he was back behind bars after violating his parole. And that's when the state got a blood sample from him.
By law in Virginia, been collecting blood samples from convicted felons for a number of years. However, the majority of them were stored. The suspect in this case, Morissette, had been placed in the system, I believe, in June, which is just maybe 60 days before we get the hit.
Doris White's timing in reopening the case couldn't have been better. When she heard about the match, she immediately called one of her husband's brothers.
I got on the telephone, told him, I said, you ain't gonna believe it, they've got the one that killed Dodd.
But by that time, Morissette was no longer in prison. He had been released in 1996. Detective Sergeant Browning tracked Morissette to his sister's home in Newport News, Virginia, and arrested him. When Browning reviewed his file, he discovered that police had interviewed Morissette shortly after Dorothy's murder.
He was one of literally hundreds of people who were asked questions about this back in 1980.
Linda Curtis was the state's prosecuting attorney for the Dorothy White case.
Until we had a DNA match, he was just a face in a crowd of people.
Now, with the DNA match, Morissette was scientifically linked to the murder, but the prosecution still had concerns.
DNA is a wonderful tool, but you have to be able to get it into evidence. We need to prove that the evidence from the time it was taken until the time it was analyzed, in this case almost 20 years later, that the chain of custody has remained intact. That is, that it hasn't been tampered with. So we were able, miraculously, to reconstruct the chain of custody in that case.
During the trial, forensic scientists explained the DNA process to the jury by using an elimination analogy.
You're in a football stadium and you ask everyone with blue jeans to stand up. And so a large number of people stand up. And then you say, okay, now everyone wearing blue jeans and a red shirt remains standing. And everyone with a blue jeans and a red shirt and white shoes remain standing. And then you keep adding factors until there's only one person there who's standing who meets all of those characteristics.
The presentation was persuasive, and in 2001, the jury found William Morissette guilty. He was sentenced to death, and his case is now on appeal.
DNA was the solution to this case. Without the DNA technology, he would still be out there. There's no question about that.
After 19 years, Dorothy White's sister-in-law had finally fulfilled the promise she made to her husband. She helped solve Dorothy's murder.
I think a lot about how would it be if Dot had been living, you know? I know that it would be wonderful.
Without Virginia's DNA databank, Dorothy White's murder would never have been solved. Today, the databank holds close to 200,000 DNA profiles. Since 1998, all states in America have access to a national DNA index system. That databank holds more than 1 million DNA profiles.
This databank has become the single most important tool to investigators whenever or wherever some physical evidence is available.